A 12-year-old homeless boy, a 7-year-old girl screaming in a graffiti-soaked alley, and a name that turned grown men cold. The night Marcus Vale threw himself between that little girl and danger. He had nothing, no family, no home, no reason anyone would come looking for him if he disappeared. He was just another invisible kid that the city had already decided didn't matter. But one beating changed everything. Because the girl he protected, her father wasn't just any man. I was the most dangerous man in the city. And what happened next? Inside that clubhouse, in the frozen dark, nobody saw coming. Stay until the end, because this story will hit you somewhere deep. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. Where are you watching from tonight? The convenience store on the corner of Delwood and Fifth had been condemned for 11 months, but nobody had gotten around to tearing it down. The city moved slow when it came to things that didn't bleed money. The plywood over the windows had warped in the November rain, pulling loose at one corner so that a person, a small person specifically, could wedge themselves behind the dumpster in the narrow gap between the building's east wall and the chain-link fence that separated the lot from the alley beyond. The gap smelled like wet cardboard and old grease, and something metallic that Marcus Vale had stopped trying to identify 3 weeks ago when he'd first found the spot. He had learned, in the 14 months since his mother died, that survival was mostly about temperature management and invisibility. You stayed out of the wind, you stayed out of the light. You made yourself small enough that the city's eyes slid over you the way they slid over fire hydrants and broken parking meters, present but unregistered, part of the background noise of a place that had too many problems to take on one more. Marcus was 12 years old, and he was very good at being unregistered. He had his back pressed against the plywood, knees drawn to his chest, the torn gray hoodie pulled up over his ears. The hoodie had been somebody else's once. He'd found it in a donation bin outside a church on Merchant Street that he'd cracked open with a bent coat hanger on a night when the temperature dropped to 19 degrees, and the alternative was worse. The donation bin had also yielded a pair of socks, one glove, and half a granola bar somebody had helpfully rewrapped in its foil. He'd eaten the granola bar in 4 careful bites, making each one last, the way his mother had taught him to make the good things last. He didn't think about his mother much. Thinking about her cost more than he could afford. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but everything was still dripping, the broken gutters, the chain link, the warped plywood. A constant thin sound like the city was slowly leaking. Marcus had eaten half a hot dog he'd recovered from the trash can outside Russo's diner on Crane Street. The other half he was saving. He didn't know why exactly. Old habit. The idea that things could always get worse, and it was smart to have something. His ribs hurt. They had been hurting for 4 days, since the night 2 men in their 20s had spotted him sleeping in the vestibule of the old Paramount Theater and decided that their entertainment for the evening was dragging him out into the street and putting boots to him. Not because he'd done anything, not because he had anything worth taking, just because he was there and small and nobody was going to call the cops over a homeless kid getting knocked around. The city had taught him that particular lesson repeatedly and with great thoroughness. He breathed carefully. Shallow. Full breaths hurt on the left side where something had either bruised or cracked. He didn't know which and couldn't afford to find out. There was a free clinic on Halsey Street that he'd visited twice in the past year, but the last time he'd gone, the woman at the intake desk had asked him pointed questions about his guardian, his home address, and whether he'd like her to contact family services. He'd left before she finished the sentence. Family services. The phrase sat in his stomach like a stone. He had been in the system once, for 6 weeks after his mother's death, in a group home on the east side run by a man named Garrett, who smelled like bourbon and disappointment, and who had made it immediately clear that the 22 boys in his care were a revenue source and nothing else. Marcus had left through a bathroom window at 2 in the morning with everything he owned in a plastic shopping bag. He was not going back. He pulled the hoodie tighter and listened to the city breathe. A dog barking somewhere south. A car horn, distant. The bass thump of music from the apartment building 2 blocks east, where the same 3 songs seemed to play on an eternal loop after 10 p.m. The hiss and groan of a city bus making its last run of the night. These were the sounds of a city that was alive but not particularly interested in him, and he had made a kind of peace with that. You survived by making peace with the things you couldn't change and spending your energy on the things you could. I was almost asleep. Or the strange half-sleep that passed for sleep these days, body alert even when the mind drifted. when he heard the girl scream. It wasn't the kind of scream that meant surprise or irritation. Marcus had grown up in neighborhoods where he'd heard both of those and learned to distinguish them from something else. The high, ragged sound of genuine terror, the kind that comes out of a body before the mind has time to decide whether screaming is a good idea. This was that sound. Female. Young. Very young. He was on his feet before he'd made a conscious decision. The alley ran behind the building to the north, connecting Dellwood to the service road that backed up against the parking structure. Marcus knew the geography, the way he knew all the geography in a 6-block radius, by necessity, by repetition, by the survival logic of knowing your exits. He moved along the chain link to the gap at the far end, squeezed through sideways, and came into the alley at a run. The scene organized itself in front of him in a fraction of a second, the way high-stress moments did, each detail sharp and separate. 2 boys, older, maybe 15 and 16, both large in the way that boys who've been eating regularly and sleeping in warm beds tend to be large, built and fed and comfortable in their size. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7, her back against the alley wall under a fire escape, backpack straps twisted around her fists like she'd been trying to hold on to it when they grabbed it. Pink backpack, one strap already ripped loose. The girl had brown hair in 2 braids that had mostly come undone, and her face was the face of someone who had just discovered that the world was capable of specific cruelties she hadn't previously imagined. The bigger of the 2 boys had the backpack. He was going through it with the casual contempt of someone who already knew there wasn't anything valuable inside and was destroying it anyway, because destruction itself was the point. The smaller boy, still significantly larger than Marcus, was standing over the girl with his arm against the wall beside her head, blocking her exit, enjoying the way she pressed herself against the brick to get away from him. Marcus didn't do a tactical assessment. There was no version of a tactical assessment that ended with him doing anything other than what he did, which was close the distance between himself and the bigger boy in 4 running steps, and drive his shoulder into the kid's ribs with everything he had. The impact was approximately what you'd expect when a 110-pound homeless kid with bruised ribs threw himself at a 170-pound teenager. The bigger boy stumbled, surprised more than hurt, and Marcus felt something grind and shift in his left side that sent white light across his vision. He got his feet under him and planted himself between the girl and both of them. "Run," he said to her. She didn't run. She pressed herself against the wall and stared at him. The 2 boys exchanged a look. The smaller one actually laughed, a short, incredulous sound. "What is this?" the bigger one said. "Get away from her," Marcus said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "Get away from her," the smaller one repeated, mimicking the flat tone, grinning at his friend. "Who are you? You her brother or something? You look like you sleep in a dumpster." He wasn't wrong. Marcus said nothing. The bigger boy dropped the backpack, not returning it, just dropping it, because it was no longer interesting, and looked at Marcus the way people looked at problems that needed to be dealt with efficiently. He cracked his knuckles. It was a theatrical gesture, the kind you picked up from movies, and under other circumstances, Marcus might have found it almost funny. These were not other circumstances. "Last chance," the bigger boy said. "Walk away, and we forget you were here." "She was scared," Marcus said. It came out quiet. Not brave. Just factual. She was scared, and that was the whole of it. The entire equation. The only math that mattered. The bigger boy hit him first. The punch caught him on the cheekbone and spun him sideways into the brick wall, and his hands went up automatically to protect his face, which meant the second punch landed in his ribs. The bad ribs. The left side. And the pain was extraordinary. The kind of pain that temporarily reorganizes the entire nervous system. His knees buckled. He didn't go all the way down. He locked his legs and straightened and turned back toward them. "Stop it!" the girl cried. "Stop hurting him!" "Move," Marcus told her, not looking at her, keeping his eyes on the 2 boys. "Get behind me and stay there." She did. She pressed herself against his back, and he felt her small hands grip the back of his hoodie, like she was holding on during a fall. And something happened in his chest that was not precisely pain, but was in the same neighborhood as pain. A raw, exposed feeling, like something that had been sealed shut for a long time had cracked open without his permission. The smaller boy grabbed his arm and swung him hard into the dumpster. The metal rang like a bell, and Marcus's shoulder took the impact, and he went down on one knee on the wet asphalt. The bigger boy stepped in and put his boot into Marcus's ribs, and the world went gray at the edges. He dragged himself back up. The smaller boy shoved him down again. He got up again. The bigger boy grabbed him by the front of the hoodie and threw him against the wall, and he hit it face first and tasted blood, copper and salt. His lips split against the brick. He turned around. He was between them and the girl. His legs were shaking. His vision was doing something complicated. He stayed between them and the girl. She was scared, he said again. His voice was thicker now, wet. You want her. You go through me. The bigger boy raised his fist for something that was going to end it. Then the smaller boy said something that stopped him cold. You know whose kid this is? Low. Almost a whisper. The grin gone. The bigger boy looked at him. Then he looked at the little girl. Something shifted in his face. Who? The smaller boy said a name. Reaper. Just the one word. And the alley changed temperature. Not metaphorically. Marcus felt it as a physical thing, a drop, the air itself going tight and cold. The bigger boy lowered his fist. His face, which had been relaxed with the comfort of someone who had never had reason to fear consequences, suddenly had a different quality. Something navigating toward panic. You sure? He said. Her face is on a poster inside the clubhouse. My cousin showed me. Both boys looked at the girl again, really looked. This time, not with contempt, but with the newly terrified attention of people who have just realized they are standing in the path of something they cannot outrun. They left. Not quickly enough to be running, some remnant of pride held the pace to a fast walk. But they were gone. Footsteps on wet asphalt fading toward the service road. Marcus stood in the alley with blood dripping off his chin and his ribs screaming and his knees threatening a second career as unstable infrastructure, and he turned to look at the girl. She was staring at him. Her braids were wrecked, her pink jacket was torn at the pocket, and she had the backpack clutched to her chest. She'd grabbed it off the ground sometime in the chaos. And her face was the specific face of a child who has just survived something and is still computing what that means. You okay? He asked. She nodded, then immediately. Are you? Yeah. This was not true. His left side felt like someone had lit a fire inside his rib cage, and his face was doing something warm and wet that suggested the split lip was more than a split lip. But the instinct to say yeah was older and more automatic than any commitment to accuracy. You need to call someone, he said. You have a phone? She shook her head. I left school to walk to my dad's place. I come on Thursdays. She said it like she was explaining something that had nothing wrong with it, a regular thing, a Thursday thing, and he could see in the way she said it that this was the established routine. Dad's place on Thursdays, a walk she'd done before, a walk that had probably always been fine until tonight. How far is his place? 14 blocks. You can't walk alone, Marcus said. You know that, right? Not now, not tonight. I know. She looked at him. Will you walk with me? He almost said no. The rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive for 14 months, ran the numbers immediately, walking 14 blocks in his current condition, bleeding, with bruised or cracked ribs, with a child who was the daughter of someone named Reaper, who apparently had her face on a poster in a clubhouse. None of this was the invisible, low-profile survival calculus that had kept him breathing. But she was looking at him the way she'd looked at him when he'd stepped between her and the boys, like he was something she'd never seen before, like she was still deciding what to call it. Yeah, he said. Okay. Her name was Lily Mercer, and she was 7 years old, and she talked with the particular intense focus of a child who has processed fear by converting it immediately into conversation. She told him about school, Mrs. Patterson's third-grade class, the science project about clouds, the boy named Devin, who she didn't like because he always took the good-colored pencils. And Marcus walked beside her and said very little and bled quietly into the collar of his hoodie and tried not to show how bad his ribs were with every step. The city around them was doing its evening transformation, that hour when the daylight city and the night city swapped custody of the streets. Shops pulling down their security gates. The diner on Crane, with its windows steamed up from the dinner rush, smell of grease and coffee drifting out when someone opened the door. A couple walking fast, heads down, not looking at anything they didn't have to. A man in a doorway drinking from a paper bag who watched them pass with empty eyes. Does it hurt? Lily asked, looking at his face. Little bit. My dad has scars, she said. On his hands and his face. I used to think they were scary. She paused. They're not scary anymore. He said scars just mean you survived something. Marcus didn't say anything to that. What's your name? She asked. Marcus, do you live near here? A beat. Around here. She seemed to accept this with the easy credulity of someone who hasn't yet learned to hear what's not being said. They walked another block. The temperature had dropped another few degrees, and Marcus could feel it in the wet fabric of his hoodie, the cold working in through the torn seams. He kept his breathing shallow and careful. My dad's going to want to thank you, Lily said. He doesn't need to do that. He's going to anyway, she said, with the confidence of someone who knows her father. He takes things like that seriously, when someone does something important. She looked up at him sidelong. You got really hurt. I'm okay. You're bleeding on your collar. I know. That means you got hurt for me. He didn't have an answer for that. The logic of it sat between them in the cold air, and he let it sit there. They turned onto Caldwell Street, 6 blocks from where she'd said the clubhouse was, according to her pointing, and that was when he heard the engines. Not one engine, several. Coming from the north, from the direction they were walking toward, the sound building from a distant rumble to something more present, more deliberate. Harley-Davidsons had a specific register. He'd grown up around the sound without ever being close to the people who made it. A deep, rhythmic percussion that you felt as much as heard, somewhere in the back of the sternum. This was 4 of them, maybe 5, moving at a pace that wasn't cruising. Lily stopped walking. She stopped and then she started running, toward the sound, not away from it, and Marcus stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the particular feeling of someone who has just realized that the situation has changed shape without warning. He followed her. The bikers came around the corner of Caldwell and Mace in a tight group, headlights cutting through the thin fog that had come up off the river, and they pulled to the curb when Lily ran into the street in front of them. The lead bike stopped first, and the others flanked it in the automatic choreography of people who have moved together long enough that it's muscle memory. The man on the lead bike was the last to take off his helmet. Later, when Marcus tried to describe what he saw in that moment, he couldn't find language that did the accuracy. Reaper Mercer was not a large man in the way that the 2 boys in the alley had been large. He was not wide or soft or conventionally imposing. He was perhaps 6 feet, lean in the way of someone who has lived mostly on tension and black coffee, and the word that Marcus's mind reached for involuntarily was carved. Like something had taken a more ordinary face and applied sustained pressure to it from multiple directions until what remained was this: the hard lines, the jaw that held a specific kind of permanent set, the eyes that were so dark they had no bottom. The scar ran from his left eyebrow down across the cheekbone and ended at the corner of his mouth, and it had been there long enough to become part of the architecture of his face rather than an interruption of it. He had maybe 35 years on him, maybe 40. It was difficult to tell on a face like his, where whatever the years had done had been absorbed and incorporated rather than simply accumulated. He swung off the bike and Lily crashed into him with the full velocity of a 7-year-old who has been scared and is no longer scared, and he caught her without any visible exertion, one arm going around her and pulling her in, his face dropping into her hair. He held her there for a moment. Just a moment, brief and private, not for anyone else. And then he straightened and his eyes came up and found Marcus. The other bikers were off their bikes by now. 4 of them. One very large man with a shaved head and a graying beard who moved with the deliberate economy of someone accustomed to being the biggest person in any room, one with military close-cropped hair, and the lean, watchful stillness of someone who spent a lot of time waiting and was very good at it. One who was older, maybe 60, with white hair pulled back and the kind of hands that suggested he'd spent decades working with them. The 4th was younger, maybe 19, still had some unfinished quality about him, like he hadn't quite settled into whatever shape he was going to be. They looked at Marcus the way men who spend time assessing threats look at something unexpected, methodical, thorough, arriving at a conclusion. Lily turned in her father's arm and pointed at Marcus. "He saved me," she said. "There were 2 boys and they were hurting me and he made them stop." Reaper Mercer looked at Marcus for a long moment. He took in the blood, the split lip, the wetness at his collar, the way Marcus was holding himself, the careful stillness of someone protecting something broken underneath. He took in the hoodie, the condition of it, the single glove, the absence of anything that could reasonably be called adequate clothing for a November night. He took in all of it, and he didn't say anything. "How bad are you hurt?" he said finally. "I'm fine," Marcus said. The big man with the shaved head made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Reaper looked at his daughter. "What happened?" Not a question. Lily told him. The whole thing, quickly and in order, with the precision of a child who knows that her father takes things seriously and that details matter. She told him about the two boys and the backpack and how Marcus had come out of nowhere and put himself between her and them and stayed there even when they were hitting him. Even when he went down, he kept getting back up. She told him what Marcus had said. He said if they wanted me, they had to go through him, she said. And they were hurting him really bad, Daddy. They were hurting him bad and he didn't stop. Reaper's face did not change. That was the thing about his face. It had a quality of absolute surface stability, like whatever was happening underneath it was happening in a place that face expressions couldn't reach. But his eyes shifted, some small internal adjustment, and he looked at Marcus again. You stood in front of her, he said. She was scared, Marcus said. The same answer, the same flat, factual delivery, because there wasn't another answer and dressing it up seemed dishonest. Something moved across Reaper's face. Not warmth, exactly. It was too controlled for warmth, too old for warmth. But something. A recognition. The way you look at something that shows you something real and unexpected and you're recalibrating. Those boys say anything before they left? The military one, Marcus would later learn his name was Rook, asked the question with the professional neutrality of someone gathering information rather than asking after curiosity. One of them said her name, Marcus said, and then he told the other one who she was, whose kid she was. He paused. That's why they stopped. Rook looked at Reaper. A thing passed between them that Marcus didn't have the context to decode. You know these boys? Reaper asked. No. They know you? No. He hesitated. I don't think they knew I was there until I was already... He stopped. He'd been about to say until I was already in it, which was accurate. Reaper studied him. Where do you live? There it was. The question that always came and that he never had a clean answer to. He'd learned a long time ago that I don't have anywhere was the answer that opened doors. He didn't want opened. Shelters, questions, people with clipboards and concerned expressions who wanted to call family services. But I live nearby was the lie that eventually collapsed under scrutiny. He said nothing. Reaper looked at him with those bottomless dark eyes, and Marcus had the uncomfortable feeling of being read. Not the surface, but the thing underneath, the specific shape of the nothing he'd answered with. Get on, Reaper said. Marcus looked at the bikes. I'm not... He started. You're bleeding, Reaper said. And you've got busted ribs. I'm not riding away and leaving you on the street. You don't have to do that. I know I don't. He said it simply, like the fact of not being obligated and the fact of intending to do something anyway were compatible states that required no further explanation. The big man, Bolt, Marcus would learn, had already produced a clean rag from somewhere and held it out toward Marcus with the slightly impatient manner of someone who has done this particular thing many times before. Marcus took it and pressed it to his lip. He comes with us, Lily said from her father's arm in the tone of someone not proposing something but announcing it. The younger biker, Ghost, 19 years old and still figuring out what that meant in this particular world, caught Marcus's eye from across the bikes and gave him a look that said, without malice, that there was no version of this conversation that ended with Marcus not getting on a bike. Marcus looked at the rag pressed to his lip. He looked at the city behind him, the condemned store, the alley, the wet asphalt, and the broken gutter still dripping, and the night expanding outward in every direction with no particular place in it that was his. He got on the bike behind Rook. The engine started, that deep, bone-settling percussion, and the group pulled out into the street, and Marcus watched the city slide past through the cold air and held himself carefully upright because of the ribs and felt, with acute awareness, the specific strangeness of being in motion toward something instead of still and invisible in the gap between a condemned building and a chain-link fence. He had no idea what was coming, but he had the particular clarity that extreme pain sometimes produces, that bright, stripped-down version of thinking where the noise goes quiet. And in that clarity he understood one thing with absolute certainty. He had made his choice in the alley, between staying invisible and stepping forward, between the careful math of survival and the older, dumber, more fundamental equation of she was scared, and you don't leave scared alone. He'd made his choice. The clubhouse appeared at the end of Caldwell like something that had grown out of the city rather than been built in it. A converted machine shop, 3-story, brick and corrugated steel, the kind of building that had accumulated its history rather than been designed with one. A steel sign above the double doors, letters. Marcus didn't read in the first pass because Rook had stopped the bike and was already swinging off with the efficiency of someone who parks here every day. A warm yellow light in the narrow windows. The sound of music from inside, old rock, something with weight to it, guitars and drums coming through the thick walls as a vibration more than a sound. Other bikes already lined up along the building's south face. More than a few, maybe a dozen. Can you walk? Rook asked. Yes, Marcus said, and demonstrated this by getting off the bike, which he did without showing anything. Rook looked at him for a moment with the same assessing flatness and seemed to decide something. He jerked his head toward the door. Inside was warmth, first. The specific dense warmth of a room where people have been gathered for a while. Smoke and body heat, and the old wood that had absorbed decades of both. The main room was large, lower ceiling than you'd expect from the outside. Rough wood tables and mismatched chairs and a long bar along the north wall, where a man with tattoos to the collar was drawing something in a mug. Photographs on the walls, group shots, bikes, faces. Marcus didn't know. Leather cuts everywhere, on chairs, on the backs of the men sitting at the tables, on hooks by the door. 7 men in the room, not counting the group that had just come in. They looked up when the door opened. They looked at Lily first. Relief, some of them. The specific relief of people who had been sitting with controlled worry and were now releasing it. Then they looked at Marcus with the comprehensive attention of people who are not accustomed to strangers. Not hostile, not warm, comprehensive. Bolt said something to Reaper in a low voice that Marcus didn't catch. Reaper nodded once. Doc, he said to the room. The man with the white hair, the older one from the street, was already moving toward a door at the back, unhooking something from a bag near the bar as he went, and the words made a category click into place. Doc. Not a nickname chosen for irony. The man was a doctor, or had been, or had learned enough in some former life to occupy the role here. Lily had not released her father's hand. She was watching Marcus with a serious, concentrated expression. He has to sit down, she told her father. He wouldn't let me see how bad it was, but he was walking really careful. I heard you, Reaper said to her, quiet. He looked at Marcus. Come on. The back room was smaller, a narrow space with a cot against one wall, and a work table with a lamp and things arranged on it with the particular logic of someone who knows where everything is. Doc had already pulled the lamp around and washed his hands at the small sink in the corner, and his manner was completely professional in the way that people are professional when they've been doing something for 30 years and no longer need to signal competence. Sit, he said to Marcus, indicating the cot. Marcus sat. The room was doing a slow revolution that he was pretending not to notice. Doc looked at his face first. The split lip, the cheekbone, the way the right side was beginning to swell, and made small sounds that meant nothing but indicated he was cataloging. He pressed gently along Marcus's cheekbone and jaw. Follow my finger, he said, and ran a brief neuro check that Marcus recognized from the one time he'd been in an ER after the incident 6 months ago that he also didn't think about. Now the ribs, Doc said. Shirt up, Marcus complied. He heard, rather than saw, the slight pause in Doc's breathing when the shirt came up. Not at the current damage, which was bad enough, but at the older damage, the yellowish residue of previous bruising across his torso, the pattern of it, that said something about frequency. Doc ran his hands along Marcus's left side with practiced pressure, and Marcus held perfectly still and breathed through his nose. 2 cracked, Doc said. Maybe 3. Nothing displaced. You're breathing all right? Yeah, going to tape them. He reached for supplies. You've had rib injuries before. It wasn't a question. Marcus didn't answer it. Doc taped his ribs with efficient, careful wrapping, and Marcus sat with his hands on his knees and breathed through the whole process and tried not to think about anything. From the main room he could hear the low, indistinct murmur of voices, the specific texture of people talking about things at measured volumes. When Doc finished, he looked at Marcus for a moment in the lamp's direct light. How old are you? He said. 12. Doc looked at him. Not with pity. Doc was not a man who indulged pity, Marcus would later understand, because he'd lived long enough to know it accomplished nothing. But with something else. The particular attention you give to a thing that deserves to be seen clearly. You have somewhere to be tonight? Doc asked. Marcus held the silence for a beat. Then he said, No. Doc nodded. Like that was the answer he'd already known, and the question had been a courtesy, an opportunity to say something other than the truth if Marcus had wanted to take it. "Then you're here tonight," Doc said, and turned off the examining lamp. When Marcus came back into the main room, Reaper was at the bar with a mug of something, and the room had rearranged itself in some way that Marcus couldn't immediately account for. Several of the men who'd been at the tables were gone. Bolt was there. Rook was there. The young one, Ghost, was near the door, sitting backward on a chair. And a man Marcus hadn't seen before had arrived and was talking to Reaper in a low voice near the bar. The new man was approximately 20 years old, built in the way of someone who'd grown up doing physical labor. And there was something in his face, a specific volatility, barely contained, the way some people carry anger like a second body, that made the hairs on Marcus's arms rise before he'd consciously registered why. He stopped talking when Marcus came back in. Reaper looked at Marcus. "You eat today?" "Some." "Bolt," Reaper said. The big man was already moving toward the kitchen. Marcus sat down at the nearest table because standing was requiring more active effort than he wanted to spend. Lily, who had apparently been deployed to a couch along the south wall with a blanket and a cup of something warm, watched him from across the room with that particular focused attention. The new man, Marcus didn't know his name yet, caught his eye and held it for a moment. Not threatening, not welcoming, just looking, trying to calculate something. Then he looked away, back at Reaper, and said something that Marcus was close enough to hear. "You sure about this?" Reaper's response was quiet. 3 words that Marcus caught only the edges of. "Not your call." The new man's jaw moved. He said nothing else. From somewhere in the city outside, Marcus heard engines. More than one. Coming this way. But these didn't sound like the measured, deliberate approach of Reaper's crew. These sounded like something else. Faster, angrier, less organized. Rook heard it too. He was at the window in 3 steps, looking out through the narrow gap at street level. "Reaper," he said. Just the name. But the way he said it changed the texture of the air in the room completely. Reaper set down his mug. Marcus looked at Lily on the couch. She had gone very still under her blanket, her small face tipped toward the sound, and in her eyes was the specific look of a child who has heard this kind of shift in the air before and knows exactly what it means. Something was coming. And Marcus, sitting at a table in a biker clubhouse with taped ribs and a split lip and borrowed warmth, with the smell of coffee and cigarette smoke and old wood around him, felt the understanding arrive with crystalline clarity. He was not outside the storm anymore. He was inside it. And the door was already opening. The door opened and the cold came in with it. Not the slow cold that had been seeping through the walls all night. The ambient cold of a November city that had settled into everything like water into old wood. This was the specific cold of the door swinging wide and the outside arriving all at once, and with it came 2 men that Marcus didn't know, moving fast, the kind of fast that meant something had already happened, or was about to. Rook stepped aside to let them in, and then closed the door and stood with his back against it. The room had changed in the 3 seconds it took for this to happen. The men at the tables straightened without appearing to straighten. Hands moved off mugs and off table edges, not reaching for anything, just repositioning. The way bodies repositioned themselves when the air changed. The first man through the door was heavy-set, 40s, with a road-worn face that had taken some structural damage over the years, and healed imperfectly. He wore his cut over a flannel shirt and his boots left wet prints on the wooden floor, and he went directly to Reaper without looking at anyone else in the room. "They're moving," he said. Reaper set down his mug with a sound that was quieter than it should have been given how hard the table was. "How many?" 6 bikes. Maybe 8. Coming up from the warehouse district. He paused. "Daggers with them." The name landed in the room, and Marcus felt, more than saw, the collective shift. Not panic. These were not men who panicked. But something recalibrated in the atmosphere, some background tension that had been at a low frequency ratcheted up 3 notches. Bolt came back from the kitchen with a plate. Actual food, something hot, eggs and toast, assembled with the graceless efficiency of a large man in a small kitchen who wasn't interested in presentation. He set it in front of Marcus without ceremony, and then straightened and looked at Reaper with the question already in his face. "Sit," Reaper said to the room. General, not loud. The men sat. Not because they were told to, Marcus would understand much later, but because Reaper saying sit meant he had a read on the situation, and the read was that they had time. And if Reaper said they had time, they had time. Marcus ate. He ate because the food was in front of him, and his body had not had a full meal in 2 days, and because something in him had decided, on a level below conscious decision-making, that if the room was sitting, then he was sitting, and if he was sitting, he was eating. The eggs were oversalted, and the toast was slightly burnt, and it was the best thing he'd eaten since a woman outside the Methodist soup kitchen on Portland Avenue had handed him a breakfast sandwich 6 weeks ago with the kind of matter-of-fact kindness that didn't require a response. He ate and he listened. The conversation at the bar was low enough that he caught only fragments, enough to understand that the name Dagger referred to a man, and that this man had some connection to the alley, and that the two boys who had cornered Lily were connected to something larger and more complicated than two teenagers making a bad decision on a Thursday evening. He caught the words "not a coincidence," and he caught the word "territory," and he caught a phrase from the heavyset man that he couldn't fully piece together, but that contained the word "message." Lily was asleep on the couch. She'd gone under fast, the way children do after fear, the body demanding its accounting immediately. One braid had come entirely undone and spread across the cushion, and someone, Ghost, Marcus thought, though he hadn't seen it happen, had tucked the blanket more firmly around her. Ghost was watching Marcus now from his backward chair, not with hostility, but with the particular undisguised curiosity of someone young enough not to have fully mastered the art of looking without being seen to look. Marcus looked back at him, steady. Ghost glanced away first. He pulled a cigarette from his breast pocket and turned it in his fingers without lighting it. "How long you been on the streets?" he asked, quiet enough that it was directed at Marcus and not the room. Marcus considered not answering. Then, 14 months. Ghost processed this. His thumb ran along the cigarette. "How old were you when it started?" 11. Another beat of processing. Ghost had the face of someone who had grown up faster than was good for him, but not as fast as he thought he had, and in his eyes was something that Marcus recognized. Not pity, which Marcus wouldn't have tolerated, but the specific recognition of someone who had also known what it was to be small in a situation designed for larger people. "My mom died," Marcus said. Not because Ghost had asked, because the sentence had come up in saying it was easier than keeping it stored. Ghost nodded. He put the cigarette in his mouth unlit. "Mine left," he said, after a moment, like it was an answer to something, or a comparison, or just the only thing he had that was in the same category. They sat with that for a moment. Then Reaper's voice cut across the room, not loud, but with the carrying quality of a voice that expected to be heard. "Ghost, outside." Ghost unfolded from the chair with the fluid ease of youth and went. The cigarette was still unlit when the door closed behind him. Marcus finished the eggs. He set the fork down and looked at the plate and felt the warmth of the food moving through him, which was doing interesting things to his pain threshold, dulling the sharpest edges, which made the duller edges more legible. His ribs throbbed in a steady, organized rhythm. His cheekbone had settled into a deep ache. His lip had stopped bleeding, which Doc had attributed to the compression and to Marcus's apparently extraordinary stubbornness. He became aware that the new man, the one who had asked Reaper, "You sure about this?" was sitting at the table across from him. Marcus hadn't heard him sit down. He was simply there, the way a problem is simply there when you look up from something else. His name, Marcus would learn, was Cade. He was 22 or 23, and he wore his volatility openly, the way some people wear their size, as a fact about themselves that they expect others to account for. His arms were on the table and his hands were loosely clasped, and he was looking at Marcus with the focused, unsmiling attention of someone who has a question and has decided to ask it directly. "You hear what they were talking about?" he said, nodding toward the bar. "Some of it. What do you think you understood?" It was phrased like a challenge, but it was actually a test. Marcus understood. The question was whether he was going to pretend to know more than he did, or whether he was going to tell the truth. He'd learned early that the men who most needed to be lied to were men like Cade, and that lying to men like Cade was also the fastest way to make them your enemy. "Something about the boys in the alley not being random," Marcus said. "Something about a man named Dagger. Something about a message." Cade studied him. His jaw moved slightly, a small grinding motion. "How do I know you weren't part of it?" he said. "Part of what?" "Someone knew Lily walked that route on Thursdays," Cade said. "Someone set it up to look like two random kids. Street kid appears out of nowhere, plays the hero." He paused. "Convenient." Marcus looked at him. The thing about Cade's theory was that it was not entirely stupid. Marcus understood that. He could follow the logic, could see the shape of the suspicion. In a world where things were routinely arranged to look like accidents, a bleeding 12-year-old appearing from an alley at exactly the right moment to save the president's daughter could absolutely be a play. He understood why someone would think that. He also understood that there was no argument he could make that would override the suspicion of a man who had already decided to be suspicious. The only thing available to him was the same thing he always had, the flat truth, said plainly, and then silence. I live behind the condemned store on Delwood and Fifth, Marcus said. I was there because the gap between the east wall and the fence blocks the wind. I heard her scream, and I moved. He held Cade's gaze. That's all of it. You expect me to believe that? I don't expect anything from you, Marcus said. I'm telling you what happened. Cade's hands unclasped and reclasped. Something moved through his face. The particular frustration of someone who wants a target and keeps encountering something that doesn't fit the target shape. From across the room, without looking up from the conversation at the bar, Reaper said, Cade, one word, the same carrying quality. Cade pushed back from the table and walked to the bar, and Marcus watched him go and breathed carefully through his nose and tried to decide what to make of the room he was in. The night pushed further along. Outside, the engines Marcus had heard earlier had not arrived. They'd passed or diverted or whatever had been coming had been redirected. Rook came in from outside around 11 and exchanged words with Reaper that involved a lot of silence between the words, which seemed to be their primary mode of communication. The heavy-set man, whose name turned out to be Priest, which struck Marcus as either ironic or earnest, and he couldn't tell which, sat down near the kitchen and ate something with the focused, joyless efficiency of a man fueling a machine. Bolt came and went twice, each time pulling on his cut with the same automatic motion, the same slight rolling of his shoulders that seemed to be how he settled the weight of it. Marcus watched all of this. He had always watched. It was one of the primary skills of being invisible, observing without appearing to observe, cataloging the details that told you whether a place was safe or dangerous and on what axis. He'd gotten very good at it. What he cataloged here, these men did not perform for each other. There was no theater, no front, none of the aggressive self-presentation that he'd learned to read as a sign of insecurity, wearing the costume of strength. They moved around each other with the practical ease of people who have spent enough time in close proximity that pretense is too expensive. The respect between them was lateral, not hierarchical in the way of men who'd organized themselves around ego, but the respect of people who had each been tested in ways the other people in the room understood and didn't need to be explained. Reaper was the center, but not because he took up space. He took up the least performative space of any of them. He moved quietly, spoke quietly, and the room organized itself around him the way water organized itself around a stone. Not because the stone demanded it, but because that's simply how the physics worked. Marcus understood, looking at all of this, that he was in a place that operated by a set of rules he didn't know yet, and that not knowing the rules in a place like this was its own kind of danger. Around midnight, Reaper came and sat across from Marcus. Not where Cade had sat, the chair beside, at an angle, not directly confrontational, but not casual either. He had a mug in one hand, and he set it on the table and looked at Marcus for a moment without saying anything. Marcus looked back at him. He'd been looking at him all night in pieces. The scar, the hands, the way he held himself. But now directly, face to face, he registered something he hadn't had the angle for before. There was something worn around the eyes. Not tired the way sleep debt wore on a face, but worn the way grief wore on a face. The specific weathering of something that had been carried a long time. Tell me about your mother, Reaper said. It was the last thing Marcus had expected him to say. He held the silence for a beat. Then, what about her? How long ago? 14 months, February. What happened? Marcus looked at the table. The wood grain, worn smooth in the center from years of mugs and forearms, and probably other things. He traced the grain with one finger without pressing. She was sick a long time, he said. She tried not to let me know how sick. She was good at pretending things were okay. He paused. She died at the hospital. I was at school. They called the school and Mrs. Dunmore pulled me out of class, and I could tell from how she was walking toward me that it was bad. He stopped. Reaper said nothing. He held the mug and said nothing and did not look away, which was its own form of attention. The kind that didn't try to fix anything or smooth anything over, that just stayed present with the shape of the thing. After that, it was family services, Marcus said. Group home. I left. Why? It wasn't, he tried to find the right word. It wasn't a home, it was a facility, and the man running it wasn't another stop. I left. Reaper nodded. Once. Like the gaps in what Marcus was saying were legible to him, and probably were. You got anyone, Reaper said. Family. Anyone. No. You sure? My mother's sister is in Tucson, Marcus said. She didn't come when my mother died. She didn't answer the phone. I called 4 times. He said this without heat, without anything, because he'd had 14 months to arrive at the place past heat, where something just became a fact about the world, something you incorporated and moved forward from. So no. Reaper was quiet for a moment. He turned the mug in his hands. You know what this place is, he said. It wasn't a question. Motorcycle club. You know what that means. Marcus considered it. Means you live by your own rules. Means you take care of your own. Reaper looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across his face again. That same deep internal adjustment that was visible only if you were paying the right kind of attention. It means when you're inside these walls, Reaper said, you're accounted for. He set the mug down. When you're outside them, you're on your own. He looked at Marcus. For tonight, you're inside. Marcus understood this to be a temporary condition offered without conditions, and the lack of conditions was itself notable. There was no transaction implied, no debt, no future obligation in the phrasing, just the statement of a fact. Tonight, inside, accounted for. He nodded. Reaper stood up. He picked up the mug and then paused and looked down at Marcus with that worn, bottomless gaze. What you did in that alley, he said. Don't explain it again. Don't justify it. It was what it was. He held Marcus's eyes for a moment. You understand me? Yes, Marcus said. Reaper moved away. Marcus sat with the warmth of the room and the organized ache in his ribs and the specific exhaustion of a body that had been through something and was now presenting the bill. And he felt, very distantly, something that he had no current name for, something that was adjacent to safety without being safety. The shadow of a thing rather than the thing itself, present and already worrying him in the way that the good things always worried him, because they were the things that left. He fell asleep at the table with his head on his arms, and he didn't dream. He woke up in a different room, narrow cot, wool blanket, heavy and real. The ceiling was low and close, and the single window near the top of the wall showed nothing but the gray pre-dawn quality of a city not yet decided about morning. He lay still for a moment and ran an inventory, ribs, face, the general structural report of his body. And then he sat up slowly and found his boots on the floor beside the cot, placed there by someone, and his hoodie hung on a peg near the door. He put the hoodie on and the boots on and opened the door. The main room was different in the early morning, quieter. 2 men at the bar nursing coffee, neither of them from last night. New faces, or faces he hadn't had angle on. The smell of the room was coffee over cigarette smoke over the wood that had been absorbing both for decades. The morning light came in through the east-facing windows in thin gray bars. Lily was gone from the couch. The blanket was folded on the cushion with the careful precision of a child trying to be helpful. Marcus stood in the doorway of the back hall and looked at the room and felt the specific disorientation of being in an unfamiliar place in the morning when sleep has cleared the adrenaline and what's left is the plain fact of where you are and how you got there. One of the men at this bar looked at him, older, 50s, face like a road map. He jerked his chin towards the coffee. Mugs are on the shelf. Marcus got a mug and poured coffee and stood near the window and drank it. Too hot. He drank it anyway. The morning moved. More men filtered in, some from back rooms, some from outside, stamping cold off their boots at the door. The room filled up in increments, the low conversation building. Marcus stayed near the window and watched and said nothing, and was given space in the way that the room had given him space the night before. Not ignored, not interrogated, just allowed to exist in the perimeter while the room did its morning things. Around 7, Reaper came in from outside with cold on his jacket and hair slightly damp from what must have been a fine rain starting up, and he moved to the coffee without looking at the room, and the room adjusted itself around his presence automatically, the way it had the night before. He looked at Marcus. Just a look. Then back at his coffee. Cade came in at 7:30. He came in with someone, a man Marcus hadn't seen before, older than Cade by 10 years, with a lean, hard face and the kind of eyes that were always doing math. He and Cade stood near the door, and their conversation was low, and Marcus couldn't hear it, but he watched Cade's face and watched the way Cade kept looking at him, Marcus, with that same calculating assessment from the night before, and felt the specific awareness that something was being decided. Rook appeared at Marcus's shoulder from somewhere, quiet enough that Marcus almost startled. "Don't worry about Cade," Rook said. "I'm not worried about him." Rook looked at him with the flat assessment of someone who has a professional interest in whether people are lying. After a moment, "Fair enough." He sipped his coffee. "He's got reasons. They're not good reasons, but they're reasons." "What reasons?" Rook looked at the window. "Last year we had a problem. Someone we thought was inside turned out to be outside. Cost us." He paused, in the particular way of someone choosing what to say and what to leave alone. Cade was close to the person it cost. Marcus processed this. The suspicion that had felt like hostility the night before reframed slightly. Not absolved, not welcomed, but made legible. Cade was a man who'd been burned by a trust he'd extended without enough evidence, and he'd learned from it, and now the learning had become its own problem. "I'm not anyone's plant," Marcus said. "I know," Rook said. "Reaper knows. Cade knows on some level. But knowing something and feeling something are different processes." He looked at Marcus directly. "Give him time." Somewhere in the city outside, Marcus heard it before he registered what it was. A sound that had entered his nervous system the night before and left a mark. Engines. Multiple. The heavy rhythmic percussion of Harley's, but different from Reaper's crew. Faster. Less organized. The sound of something with no particular discipline about it. Rook set his coffee down. The men in the room, all of them, simultaneously, with the coordination of people who don't need to discuss what a sound means, got up. Reaper was already at the window. The engines pulled up outside. Not at the door. They stopped at the curb on the south side, which Marcus could see from his window angle, and what he could see was 6 bikes and 7 men getting off them with the specific unhurried movement of people who know exactly how much time they have and are choosing to use all of it. The man in front was the one Marcus understood to be Dagger, though no one had described him, and Marcus was working from implication. He was perhaps 40, with the kind of build that suggested his 20s had been spent in very physical work, and his 30s in somewhat less, and a face that had organized itself around something cold at the center. He wore his cut differently from Reaper's men, tighter, more self-conscious, the way some men wore a uniform to be seen wearing it. He did not come to the door. He stopped at the curb and stood there. "He's not coming in," Priest said from somewhere behind Marcus. "He wants Reaper to come out," Bolt said. "That's not happening," said Rook. Reaper moved toward the door, and every man in the room made a slight motion. Not to stop him, not to follow him, but the reflexive small motion of people who are ready. Reaper looked at Bolt and Rook with a glance that contained an instruction, and they fell in behind him as he opened the door. Marcus stayed at the window. He could see the angle of the confrontation from here. Reaper stopping on the step, Bolt and Rook flanking, Dagger standing at the curb with his 6 men arrayed behind him in the way of people who have rehearsed this. He couldn't hear the conversation from here, but he could read it the way you read a scene through glass. The body language, the pacing, the specific geometry of who moves and who holds still. Dagger was doing most of the talking. Reaper was doing almost none, which Marcus had already learned was not a sign of passivity. Dagger's hands moved when he spoke. Reaper's didn't. At some point, Dagger looked past Reaper toward the building, past him, toward the windows. His eyes moved along the windows, and Marcus had the specific sensation of a gaze landing on him through glass, which was probably projection, probably the paranoid interpretation of an anxious nervous system, except that Dagger's eyes stopped on the window where Marcus was standing and held there for a beat that was 2 beats too long. Marcus did not move back from the window. Dagger's eyes moved on. The conversation ended, not with any visible conclusion, just Reaper turning and coming back inside, Bolt and Rook behind him, the door closing, and outside the sound of the engines starting again and pulling away. "What did he want?" Cade asked, immediately, from across the room. Reaper shrugged off his jacket and handed it to no one, just draped it over the nearest chair, and went to the coffee. "He wanted to know if we had something of his," Reaper said. The room was quiet. "Do we?" the older man from the bar asked. Reaper poured his coffee and turned around. His eyes went to Marcus. Marcus sat very still. "That's what I'm figuring out," Reaper said. The sentence sat in the room like a lit match. Not threatening, Reaper's voice had not been threatening, had been, if anything, more neutral than usual, the voice of a man thinking out loud. But the implication of it, the weight of what it might mean, that the boy who had appeared in the alley to save Lily was connected somehow to the man who had apparently orchestrated the alley, reorganized the air in the room completely. Every face in the room was on Marcus. "I don't know who he is," Marcus said. Flat, direct. "I've never seen him before." "He says different," Rook said quietly. Marcus looked at Rook. "What does he say?" "He says you've been running errands for his crew out of the warehouse district for the past month." The silence that followed was the specific silence of an accusation landing in a room full of people who are deciding whether to believe it. Marcus thought about the past month. He thought about the nights in the warehouse district when he'd slept in the loading dock behind the old Hessler textile building because it had a heat vent. He thought about the man who'd approached him 6 weeks ago and offered him $20 to carry a package 3 blocks. He hadn't known what was in the package. He hadn't asked. $20 bought a week of basics, and the arithmetic of survival didn't leave much room for scruples about unknown packages. He thought about how that would look, stated plainly, in this room, right now. "I carried something for someone once," he said, 6 weeks ago. "I didn't know who he was. I didn't know what I was carrying." He looked at Reaper, not at the room. "That's what they're going to use." Reaper looked at him. His face had that carved stillness. "Why tell me that?" Reaper said. "Because you'd find out," Marcus said. "And because it's true, and because—" He stopped. He'd been about to say something that he hadn't said out loud to anyone in 14 months. Something that had lived in the sealed-shut place in his chest alongside his mother's face. He let it come up. "Because I don't have anything," he said. "I don't have anything, and I haven't had anything for a long time. And last night someone put food in front of me, and someone taped my ribs, and someone let me sleep somewhere with a door on it. And I could have lied, and maybe you wouldn't have found out for a while." He held Reaper's eyes. "But I'm not going to lie to you." The room was very quiet. Cade made a sound. Something between a laugh and a scoff, a short exhalation of air that said "this kid," and then other things that weren't translatable into words. "Doc," from the hallway, "let him finish." "He's finished," Cade said. "He already gave you the whole story." "Cade," Reaper's voice, not louder, just different. Cade stopped. Reaper looked at Marcus for a long moment. He turned his coffee mug in his hands. He looked at the window, at the empty curb where Dagger's bikes had been. Then he looked at Bolt. "Find out what was in that package," he said. Bolt nodded once and was moving. To Rook, "Find out who the boys from the alley work for. Full chain." To the room, "Nobody talks to anyone outside until I say." Then he looked at Marcus. One more time. And in his eyes, Marcus could see the calculation still running, the assessment still open, not resolved. Reaper was not a man who rushed conclusions. But beneath the calculation there was something else, something harder to name. "You stay here," he said. "You don't go anywhere." "Okay," Marcus said. "Not a request," Reaper said. "I know," Marcus said. The morning ground forward. Men came and went with the purposeful movement of people who have been given tasks they understand. Marcus sat at the table and felt the room move around him and tried to understand the shape of what had just happened. He was inside something now. That much was clear. Not by choice, or not by a choice he'd been conscious of making, but by the accumulated weight of small decisions that had each seemed reasonable in the moment and had together produced a situation he couldn't see the exit of. Dagger was using him. That was the shape of it, or the beginning of the shape. Someone had sent 2 boys to that alley, knowing that Lily walked the route on Thursdays, and someone had set it up to look random, and somehow in that calculus there was a role for Marcus that he didn't fully understand yet. Whether the role had been planned from the beginning, whether the man who'd approached him in the warehouse district had already been building toward this, or whether Dagger had simply seen an opportunity and incorporated it, Marcus didn't know. What he knew was this. He was 12 years old, he had nothing, and the man outside wanted something from the men inside, and he was the item of exchange being discussed. And the men inside had not decided yet. Ghost sat down across from him around noon. He brought 2 mugs of coffee and set one in front of Marcus with the same graceless efficiency that Bolt brought to food, the gesture completely stripped of ceremony, and looked at him. "You okay?" Ghost said. "No," Marcus said, which surprised both of them. Ghost nodded. He wrapped his hands around his mug. Outside, the rain had graduated to something more committed, a steady November rain that ran down the windows in thin lines and turned the world outside the glass into a blurred gray watercolor. Reaper's going to figure it out, Ghost said. I know. That's not the problem, though, is it? Marcus looked at him. The problem, Ghost said slowly, working it out as he went, is that even if he figures out you weren't part of it, even if that's completely clear, Dagger still used you. Which means Dagger knows about you, knows what you look like, knows you were in the alley, knows where you sleep. He paused. You can't go back to that spot. Marcus had already known this, but hearing it said plainly by someone else made it more real in a specific way. The way things became more real when they were witnessed. So I need somewhere else, Marcus said. Ghost nodded. A moment of quiet between them, the rain against the windows, the low conversation of the room beyond. Reaper takes things seriously, Ghost said. What you did for Lily. What you told him this morning. He turned the mug in his hands. I've been here 2 years. I've never seen him look at someone the way he looked at you. How did he look at me? Ghost thought about how to say it. Like you reminded him of something, he said. Before Marcus could answer, the door from the back hall opened. Bolt came in. His face had a quality Marcus hadn't seen on it yet. Something had shifted in the large, deliberate architecture of his features, and whatever that shift was, it landed in the room before he said anything, and the room responded. Conversations stopped. Chairs turned. Bolt looked at Reaper, who was at the end of the bar. The package, Bolt said. 6 weeks ago. Warehouse district. Hessler block. What was in it? A phone, Bolt said. A prepaid phone. Dagger's man delivered it to someone 3 blocks over, someone in our crew. He paused. Each word placed deliberately. Someone who's been feeding information for 4 months. The silence was absolute. Reaper's face did not move, but something in the room, some last ambient pressure, collapsed and became something else entirely. And Marcus felt it the way you felt a change in weather, in the bones before the first drop fell. There was a traitor inside the clubhouse, and the 12-year-old boy sitting at the table was the thread that had just unraveled the whole thing. In the back hallway, a door opened. Footsteps on the wood floor. A shape in the doorway. And Marcus looked up and saw for the first time the face of the man who had handed him $20 on the Hessler block 6 weeks ago. He was wearing a cut. He was one of them. And he was looking at Marcus with an expression that contained in equal measure the cold calculation of someone whose plan has just been exposed, and the particular desperation of a man who understands that the room he's standing in is about to become the most dangerous place in the city. Marcus didn't move, didn't breathe, because the man's hand was moving toward the back of his cut, toward something tucked at the small of his back, and the room still hadn't seen it, was still processing Bolt's words, was still 1/2 second behind the moment. Marcus moved before his mind caught up with his body. Gun. The word came out of him raw and loud and wrong-sounding in the room. Too young, too thin. But it landed where it needed to land. Rook dropped behind the bar in one motion. Bolt was already turning. Ghost hit the floor, and the man in the doorway, his name was Terrell, Marcus would learn this later, would learn all of it later, pulled the weapon and swung it toward Reaper. He didn't get there. Bolt crossed the room in 3 steps and hit Terrell like something structural failing, and the gun discharged into the ceiling. A single detonation that compressed the air in the room and left a ringing silence behind it like a held breath. And then Terrell was on the floor with Bolt's knee in his back and the gun skidding across the wood into the far wall. Plaster dust drifted down from the ceiling. Nobody spoke for 3 full seconds. Then Reaper walked across the room and picked up the gun and cleared it with the flat mechanical efficiency of someone who has handled firearms the way other people handle coffee mugs. Without ceremony, without drama, just a thing that needed doing. He ejected the magazine, racked the slide, caught the chambered round. Set everything on the bar with 4 separate sounds, each one distinct in the silence. He looked down at Terrell. Terrell was breathing hard against the floor. He was 30, maybe 31, with a cut that had 2 years of patches on it, and a face that had been, until approximately 40 seconds ago, completely unremarkable. The face of someone you passed in a hallway and didn't register. Now it had a quality of terrible exposure, the face of a man who has been seen doing the thing he can never take back. "Get him up," Reaper said. Bolt got him up. Not gently. They put him in a chair in the center of the room. Not tied. There was nowhere for him to go, and everyone in the room understood this, and Terrell understood it most of all. He sat with his hands on his knees and his head slightly down, and his breathing still ragged from the impact. Marcus was still standing at the table. He hadn't moved since the word had come out of him. His heart was doing something architectural in his chest, a deep structural pounding, and his hands were flat on the table surface, and he was pressing them down, hard, to stop them from shaking. Reaper pulled a chair around and sat across from Terrell. The distance between them was approximately 3 feet, and Reaper sat in it like it was 3 miles. "How long?" he said. Terrell said nothing. "Terrell." No louder. "How long?" A long silence. Then, 8 months. The number landed. 8 months. Cade made a sound that wasn't a word, something that came from somewhere below language. The specific sound of a man receiving confirmation of the thing he'd already feared was true, and discovering that knowing it in advance did not make it smaller. "What did you give him?" Reaper said. "Roots. Schedules." Terrell's voice was flat and emptied out, the voice of someone past the pretense of alternatives. "Lily's school schedule, the Caldwell address." Bolt's hands moved at his sides. "The address," Rook said. "Yes." "The Thursday walk," Reaper said. "Yes." The room didn't erupt. That was the thing that struck Marcus most. The room didn't erupt, didn't become what he would have expected a room to become when a betrayal of this magnitude was spoken aloud. The men in it absorbed it and went very still, the way things went still before they became extremely dangerous, the stillness of loaded mechanisms. Reaper looked at Terrell. His face was the carved, surface-stable face, but the worn quality around his eyes had intensified into something Marcus couldn't name precisely. It was not anger, or not only anger. It was the face of a man processing the fact that someone who ate at his table, slept under his roof, wore his crew's colors, had been selling his daughter to a predator for 8 months. "Why?" Reaper said. Terrell's jaw worked. "Dagger has my brother," he said. "Has had him for a year. Said if I didn't feed him information..." He stopped. "What's your brother's name?" Bolt said from behind him. "That's not..." Terrell started. "His name," Bolt said. "Danny. Daniel Reese. He's 19. He got into debt with Dagger's crew out of the warehouse district, and Dagger took him, and I've been trying to get him back for..." "You used a child," Cade said. The words were quiet, and they were the most dangerous words in the room. He was standing against the wall with his arms crossed, and his face had arrived at a place past anger that was colder and more permanent. "You used Lily to get your brother back." Terrell said nothing. "He's 19, Cade said. She's 7. I didn't..." Terrell's voice cracked. "I didn't know they were going to put hands on her. Dagger said it was just about visibility, about showing Reaper he could reach..." "Stop," Reaper said. Terrell stopped. Reaper stood up. He moved away from the chair and stood with his back to the room, facing the window, and the rain ran down the glass in thin gray lines, and outside the city moved without awareness of what was happening in this room. He stood there for a long moment, and nobody spoke. Then he turned around. "Dagger has a 19-year-old kid," he said, to the room. "He used that kid to leverage one of ours. He used our man to run a play on my daughter." He looked at Terrell. "He also used a 12-year-old homeless boy as a delivery mechanism for a phone, which means he'd been watching that block for at least 6 weeks, which means this has been in motion longer than 8 months. He looked at Marcus when he said this. Not with accusation, with something more complicated, with the look of a man recalculating a geometry. "This wasn't about visibility," Reaper said quietly. "This was about the Caldwell address, the clubhouse location. Dagger's been building to a move on us, and Lily was the confirmation test. He wanted to know if we'd show ourselves to protect her, wanted to see who came, how many, how fast." He paused. "Last night was a reconnaissance." The silence that followed had a different quality from the previous silences. This was the silence of men understanding something they hadn't understood before and computing what it meant. "He knows our numbers," Rook said. "He knows our response time," Bolt said. "He knows the address was real," said Priest. Marcus stood at the table and felt the shape of it closing around him, the full geometry of what he'd walked into when he'd heard a girl scream in an alley and moved toward the sound without thinking. He had been a piece in a play he hadn't known was happening, a prop, an unwitting actor in someone else's scene. And the phone he'd carried 6 weeks ago, the $20, The 3-block walk on the Hessler block had been the beginning of a chain that ended here, in this room, with a man's betrayal exposed and a crew's position compromised, and Dagger somewhere in the city knowing everything he needed to know. "We need to move," Rook said. "We can't move the whole operation in—" the older barman started. "We don't have a choice," Rook said. "He'll come tonight. He has everything he needs." Reaper looked at Marcus. The full, direct, assessing look. Not the compassionate version from the previous night, and not the calculating version from this morning. Something else. Something that was deciding. "You heard him in the alley say her name," Reaper said. "The boy. He used the name Reaper." "Yes," Marcus said, "meaning they expected her to tell us. Expected us to hear that she'd been identified." He paused. "Which means the boys were never the real threat. They were the announcement." Marcus understood. The announcement that Dagger could reach inside Reaper's life whenever he chose to. That no perimeter was complete. That the daughter of the most dangerous man in the city could be cornered in an alley on a Thursday evening, and there was nothing Reaper's numbers or reputation or roads could do about it because the information was already inside. "We have to find the brother," Ghost said, from the floor, where he was still sitting with his back against the bar. "We will," Reaper said. "And Dagger," Cade said. Reaper looked at him. "We will," he said again, with an identical inflection that somehow meant something completely different. He looked at Marcus one final time, and in that look was the last piece of the calculation arriving at its conclusion, the assessment completing. "You called it," he said, quiet. "You saw it before anyone in this room." Marcus said nothing. 12 years old, Reaper said. Not mockery. Not wonder. Just the plain fact of it, held up to the light. Outside, through the rain and the wet glass, Marcus heard it. Distant, growing, the sound of Harley engines. More than 6 this time, more than 8. The sound of something organized and numerous moving through the streets, with the particular directional pull of things that know exactly where they are going. Dagger wasn't waiting for tonight. He was already coming, and Marcus stood in the center of a room full of dangerous, wounded, betrayed men, with nowhere behind him and nothing ahead of him except the next 30 seconds, and felt the last version of himself. The invisible boy, the careful boy. The boy who survived by being small and still and unregistered, crack open, and the room moved, not chaotically. That was the thing that hit Marcus hardest in the first 3 seconds, the thing that separated these men from every other version of danger he'd encountered in 14 months on the street. There was no shouting, no scrambling, no the particular disorganized panic of people surprised by something they hadn't prepared for. The room moved like a mechanism engaging, each part finding its function with the automatic precision of people who had run this particular drill enough times that the drill had become instinct. Reaper's voice cut through the engine sound from outside. "Back door, now!" Bolt already had Terrell by the collar, moving him toward the rear hall. Not with violence, with the efficient purposefulness of a man relocating a problem. Rook was at the weapons locker behind the bar, a steel cabinet that Marcus hadn't registered as a weapons locker until it was open and he could see what was inside. Priest was on a phone, short-clipped sentences, calling numbers he knew by memory. Ghost was beside Marcus, hand on his arm, not grabbing, just present. "Come on," Ghost said. "Lily," Marcus said. "She's not here. Reaper sent her with Doc at 6 this morning." Ghost's hand tightened slightly on his arm. "She's safe. Move." Marcus moved. The back of the building was a different architecture from the front. Narrower, more utilitarian, the original machine shop bones visible in the exposed beams, and the concrete floor and the wide rear bay doors that opened onto the service alley. 3 bikes were already in the bay, and 2 more men Marcus hadn't met yet were pulling them forward with the focused urgency of people who'd received a signal. The engine sound outside had grown. It was no longer distant. It had the quality of something that had arrived and was positioning itself. The way sound changed when it stopped traveling and started surrounding. Reaper came through the rear door and looked at the bay and looked at his men and did a count that took approximately 1 second. "They'll have the alley covered," Rook said beside him. "I know." "So we're not running." "No," Reaper said. "We're not running." Something in the room shifted with those 3 words. A collective thing, a pressure change, the specific atmosphere of men who have been given the answer they expected and needed and are now operating from it completely. Not relief. Nothing as soft as relief. the hard, clean clarity of a decision made and accepted. Reaper looked at Marcus. "You stay in this building," he said. "Back room, door closed. You don't open it for anyone who doesn't say the word first." "What's the word?" Marcus said. "Lily," Reaper said. He turned away, pulled his cut straight with the same shoulder roll motion Marcus had seen on Bolt. The settling of weight, the assumption of it. He took the weapon Rook held out to him and checked it and holstered it and looked at his crew. "They want the building," he said. "They're not getting it." That was all. No speech, no performance, just the plain statement of the fact they were all about to make true. Ghost stayed with Marcus. He steered him toward the back room, the same room where Doc had taped his ribs, the cot still there, the lamp still angled toward the table. And he stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at Marcus with the young, not quite finished face. "You'll be okay," he said. "Go," Marcus said. Ghost looked at him. Then he went. The door closed. Marcus stood in the small room and listened to the building and the city and tried to breathe through his taped ribs with the careful discipline Doc had shown him, the shallow, steady rhythm that kept the pain manageable. His hands were at his sides. He pressed them flat against his thighs and felt the tremor in them. Adrenaline, fear, the body's honest accounting, and let it be there without trying to stop it. Outside, the engine stopped. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Marcus had ever heard. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then the front of the building received an impact, not an explosion, something more deliberate, something structural and intended. And Marcus felt it through the floor, through the soles of his boots, the whole building registering it the way a body registered a blow. Then voices. From outside through the walls. Dagger's voice, carrying, shaped for a crowd. The voice of a man who understood theater. "Reaper, we're going to do this the easy way or the other way. Your choice." Silence from inside. "I've got 12 men," Dagger said. "I've got the front and the alley. You've got 6. A pause. Then Reaper's voice from somewhere near the front of the building, carrying with complete calm, 7. A beat. Then Ghost's voice from a different position, 8. Bolt. 8. The sound of Dagger processing this. Then, "The boy." Nothing from inside. "The boy," Dagger said again. 12 years old, street kid from Delwood. I know he's in there. I want him outside in 2 minutes, or we stop doing this the easy way." Marcus pressed himself against the wall beside the door. His heart was a single sustained impact against the inside of his chest. He understood, with the cold clarity that extreme danger produced, that he was the negotiating chip, the thing being offered in exchange for a version of this that didn't end with the building coming apart. He understood that Dagger was not actually going to stop if Marcus walked out, that the offer was theater for the benefit of Dagger's own men, a performance of reasonableness before the unreasonable thing. He also understood something else, something that arrived with the particular quiet certainty of a truth that had been building for a while and had just finished building. He put his hand on the door. In the main room, the confrontation had moved inside, not through force, but through the specific tactical decision that fighting through a door was worse than controlling the space behind it. Marcus could hear it, the voices, the boot steps on the wood, the sharp exchange of men talking with the economy of people who are also positioning and watching and calculating simultaneously. He heard Cade's voice. "There's a kid in that back room." He heard a voice he didn't know, rough and flat. "Then get him out." He heard Rook, very quiet. "Nobody goes in that room." He heard the impact that followed that statement, fist or body, something physical, the sound of a confrontation going from verbal to contact, and he heard the secondary sounds of the room erupting, the specific dense cacophony of multiple physical confrontations happening in a confined space, boots on wood and bodies against walls, and the grunts of men exerting maximum effort against other men doing the same. He opened the door. The main room was a controlled chaos. 8 of Dagger's men inside, which meant 4 still outside covering the exits, and Reaper's crew meeting them in the tight geography of the space with the tactical advantage of people who knew every corner of it. Marcus took it in a fraction of a second the way he'd taken in the alley. Rook down on one knee but moving, blood from somewhere on his face. Bolt with 2 men against him and managing both. Cade against the bar, controlled and brutal. Ghost against the east wall, not going down. And Dagger. He was at the center of the room. Not fighting, watching, directing, the man whose function was command, and who had enough men around him to keep him at a remove from the physical. He was looking toward the back hall. He saw Marcus the moment Marcus saw him, and in his face, the cold, calculating face that had been described to Marcus by implication all night, and that he was seeing clearly for the first time, Marcus saw the thing that made it all legible. This wasn't about territory. It wasn't about the clubhouse address or Reaper's roots or any of the operational intelligence that Terrell had been feeding him. It was personal. The look on Dagger's face when he saw Marcus was not the look of a man looking at a tool. It was the look of a man looking at something that had disrupted a plan he'd spent a long time building, something that had introduced a variable he hadn't accounted for, something that had arrived from nowhere in an alley and broken the precise machinery of what he'd been constructing. He took a step toward the back hall. Marcus didn't move back. "You're the complication," Dagger said. Conversational, almost. 3 feet between them now, the chaos of the room happening around them like weather. "You know that? One homeless kid decides to be a hero, and here we are." "Here we are," Marcus said. Something moved in Dagger's face, the beginning of a smile that didn't reach the calculation in his eyes. "You got guts," he said. "I'll say that." "The brother," Marcus said. "Danny Reese. Where is he?" The smile stopped forming. The calculation sharpened. "What do you know about—" "Where is he?" Marcus said again. A beat. Dagger studying him. Then, quietly, "Know where you can help him." "Reaper can," Marcus said. Dagger looked at him for a long moment. Something was running behind his eyes. Reassessment. Adjustment. He was a man who ran calculations the way other men breathed, constantly, automatically. And the calculation was running now, taking in the boy in front of him and the room behind him and the fact that the 6 men he'd walked in with were not finishing this the way they were supposed to be finishing it. Then Reaper's voice from behind Dagger. "He's right." Dagger turned. Reaper was standing 6 feet away. He had blood on his jaw from somewhere and his breathing was elevated and he was completely, terrifyingly calm. Bolt was beside him. Cade was at the other flank. The geometry of the room had shifted. Dagger's remaining men were contained, not fighting, held in the specific stillness of people who have looked at the arithmetic and understood it. "It's done," Reaper said. Dagger looked at the room, did the count. His jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're into," Dagger said. "Reese is one piece. There are people above me that you—" "Tell me about them," Reaper said. A silence. Dagger and Reaper 3 feet apart, and between them everything. 8 months of betrayal. 1 7-year-old girl in an alley, 1 homeless boy who'd heard a scream and moved toward it, 1 19-year-old kid used as leverage, and the long tangled chain of cause and consequence that had led every person in this room to this specific moment. Dagger looked at Marcus one more time, a look that contained something Marcus would spend a long time afterward trying to decode. It wasn't hatred, wasn't contempt. It was something closer to acknowledgement. The look of a man who had planned for every variable and had not planned for this one, and was honest enough with himself to know it. "You're going to owe me," Dagger said to Reaper. "No," Reaper said. "I'm not." Dagger's hand moved toward his jacket. Every person in the room went absolutely still. And Marcus, standing at the edge of the back hallway with his taped ribs and his split lip and his borrowed warmth, watched Dagger's hand stop, watched the calculation complete itself, watched the man arrive at the end of the math, and held his breath for what felt like the longest moment in his 12 years on Earth, the moment that everything in the previous 24 hours had been building toward, the moment when all of it was. Dagger's hand came away from his jacket empty. Not because anyone stopped him, not because Reaper moved or Bolt shifted or the room made any threat that hadn't already been made. He brought his hand away empty because he'd run the calculation to its end, and the end was the same number every time he ran it, and he was, beneath everything, a man who understood arithmetic. He looked at Reaper. "Warehouse District," he said. "Hessler Block. Storage Unit 7. The Reese kid is there." A pause. Each word placed with the deliberate care of a man making a payment. "Alone. He's been alone since yesterday morning." "Why?" Reaper said. "Because I was done with him." Dagger said it without inflection, the way you said a thing that was simply true and unpleasant, and you were past the pretense of making it sound like anything else. "Terrell gave me what I needed. The Reese kid was overhead." Something moved through the room at that. A collective tightening, the specific anger of men who had been in situations where they were overhead, where they were the inconvenient surplus in someone else's accounting, and knew exactly what that word meant when a man like Dagger used it. Bolt's hands were fists at his sides. "He's alive," Dagger said. It was directed at Bolt, or at the room, the offering of the one fact that might hold the room at its current temperature. Dehydrated, probably. Scared, but alive. Reaper looked at him for a long moment. The carved face. The worn eyes. The scar running its permanent line from eyebrow to jaw. He looked at Dagger the way you looked at something you'd assessed completely and were now simply waiting to move past. "Rook," he said. "Already on it," Rook said, from somewhere behind Marcus, phone already at his ear. Reaper looked at his remaining men, Dagger's men, the ones who'd come in and were now contained in the geometry of the room, standing with the specific stillness of people who have accepted an outcome. He looked at them without particular feeling. "Go," he said. They went. Not running. Walking, with the controlled dignity of people who have been allowed to leave, which was its own kind of message. Dagger went with them, last, and at the door he paused without turning around. "The people above me," he said. "They're going to want to know why." "Tell them whatever you need to tell them," Reaper said. A beat. Then Dagger went through the door and the cold came in briefly, and then the door closed and he was gone. The room breathed. It breathed in the specific way of a space that has been holding pressure for an extended period and has been allowed to release it. Not an exhale of relief. Not yet. But the first moment when the held thing is no longer being held. Men moved, hands unclenched. Someone sat down heavily on the nearest chair. Ghost slid down the east wall to the floor and put his head back against the plaster and closed his eyes and opened them again. Rook was talking into the phone in the clipped, directional shorthand of someone giving coordinates to people who know how to use them. He moved toward the back door as he talked, pulling his cut straight with the habitual shoulder roll, already transitioning from the room to the next thing. Cade stood in the center of the space with blood on his knuckles and his arms at his sides and his face doing something complicated. He looked at the door Dagger had gone through. He looked at the floor. He looked at nothing in particular for a moment. The specific expression of a man processing the gap between what he'd prepared himself for and what had actually happened. Then he looked at Marcus. Marcus was still in the mouth of the back hallway. He hadn't moved from the spot. His hands had stopped shaking somewhere in the last 60 seconds. Or maybe the shaking had relocated to somewhere internal where it wasn't visible, which amounted to the same thing in terms of presentation, if not in terms of experience. He was looking at Cade. Cade looked at him for a long moment. The volatile, calculating face. The jaw that held its particular set. He looked at Marcus the way he'd been looking at him since the night before, with the measuring attention of a man who has been burned and is checking everything for heat. Then he looked away. He walked to the bar and poured something and drank it standing up, his back to the room. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't absolution. It was the specific movement of a man who has arrived at a conclusion and is declining to make a speech about it, and Marcus understood. With the particular literacy that 14 months of reading people in difficult situations had given him, that it was the most Cade was capable of in this moment, and that it was enough. Bolt came to stand beside Marcus. He was bleeding from a cut above his ear that had run down the side of his face and dried in a dark line along his jaw, and he appeared completely indifferent to this. He looked at Marcus with the flat, comprehensive attention he brought to everything. "You opened the door," he said. "Yeah," Marcus said. "Reaper told you to stay in the room." "I know." Bolt looked at him. Something moved in the large, settled face, something that was not quite a smile but occupied the same general territory, a small internal movement that found its way to the surface briefly and then was gone. "Don't make that a habit," Bolt said. He walked away toward the kitchen, and Marcus heard the tap running a moment later, and then the sound of Bolt dealing with the cut above his ear with the same graceless efficiency he brought to everything involving himself. The next hour was the specific organized aftermath of something violent that had not gone as far as it could have gone, which was its own kind of gift, Marcus understood, even when the gift didn't feel like one yet. It felt like the particular exhaustion that came after sustained fear, the body presenting its accounting all at once, every deferred sensation arriving simultaneously, the ribs, the face, the cold that had been ambient background and was now foreground, the hunger that had been suppressed by adrenaline reasserting itself. Doc arrived at some point, not from inside the building but from outside, the back door, with the cold on his jacket and a bag over his shoulder. He'd been with Lily. He'd gotten word and come back. leaving Lily with a woman Marcus hadn't met whose name was apparently Sable, and who Doc described only as trustworthy, which in this context Marcus understood to be the highest available designation. Doc moved through the room the way he moved through everything, with the professional efficiency of someone whose function was the body and its damage, and who had long since made his peace with the frequency of both. He dealt with Rook's face. He dealt with a man named Torres, who had a hand that had taken structural damage and was now purple and swollen in ways that suggested carpals rather than skin. He looked at Ghost's ribs, which had taken a boot at some point, and pronounced them bruised but intact, and gave Ghost a look that said surviving was its own reward, and that was all the sympathy available at this time. He came to Marcus last. He looked at the ribs, which had survived the night without additional displacement, which Doc attributed to the tape and to what he called your apparently unreasonable stubbornness. He looked at the face, the cheekbone now fully declared in purple and yellow, the lip healing within its own parameters. He shone a light in Marcus's eyes and ran the same neurocheck as the night before. "You'll live," he said. "Good to know," Marcus said. Doc looked at him for a moment. Not with the professional neutrality he brought to the physical assessment, but with something else. The look of a man who has seen a great many things and is taking a moment to register this one clearly. "You called the gun," Doc said. "I saw his hand move." "The men in this room have been reading situations for a combined 100 years, Doc said. "You called it before any of them." Marcus didn't say anything. Doc nodded, the small single nod, the acknowledgement without inflation. He packed his bag and moved on, and Marcus sat in the back room on the cot with the lamp making its small yellow circle and listened to the building settling around him. Rook found Danny Reese at the Hessler Block storage unit at 2:17 in the morning. This information arrived back at the clubhouse via Priest's phone in a series of clipped functional sentences that Priest relayed to Reaper at the bar. Danny Reese was 19 years old and had been in the storage unit for 4 days with a sleeping bag and minimal water and a fear that had compacted itself, in 4 days of solitary confinement, into something that sat behind his eyes like a permanent resident. He was dehydrated and had lost weight and had a bruised orbital socket from something that had happened before the storage unit. He was otherwise physically intact, Terrell was told by Rook. The telling happened in the room where Terrell had been sitting since Bolt put him in the chair, and Marcus wasn't in the room for it. He heard it through the wall. Not the words, just the sound of it, which was Rook's voice, level and brief. And then a silence, and then a sound from Terrell that was not words either, just the sound a person made when something terrible and something the opposite of terrible arrived at the same time, and the body had no adequate instrument for expressing both simultaneously. The silence that followed that sound was long. Then Rook came back into the main room and closed the door quietly behind him, and no one asked him about his face. Danny Reese was brought to the clubhouse at 3 in the morning by 2 men Marcus hadn't met, and was taken directly to the back room beside the one Marcus had slept in. Doc went in and came out 20 minutes later and said he needed fluids and sleep and time, in that order, and that the orbital socket was old enough that there was nothing to do for it now. He said the kid would be okay. He said this in the specific factual register that meant it was true, and not a comfort offered in place of truth. Terrell was allowed to sit with his brother at 3:40 in the morning. Marcus didn't see this either, but he heard, through the wall, the low voices. One of them, Terrell's, with a quality in it that Marcus recognized from the inside as the specific quality of a person saying, "I'm sorry," in a language that had more sentences in it than those 2 words, and then a longer quiet, and then nothing. Reaper was at the window when Marcus came back to the main room. The same position as the night before, standing at the east-facing window with the city lights on the other side of the glass. The specific quality of a man who thought better in front of windows, or who needed the reminder of the city's continued existence when things inside the building had been extreme. He had a cigarette this time. He didn't smoke it so much as hold it, the smoke rising in a thin, undisturbed column because the room was still and warm. Ghost was asleep on the couch. Someone had put a blanket over him with the same anonymous care that had covered Lily the night before, and he lay with his mouth slightly open and his young face completely slack, all the performance of toughness dissolved by sleep into something that looked approximately his actual age, which was approximately 17 years younger than he usually seemed. Marcus sat down at the table, the same table where he'd eaten eggs and toast at some point the previous night, which felt like a different week. He pulled his knees up and wrapped his arms around them and looked at the room. Cade was still at the bar, still awake. He was nursing something in a glass and looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man running a retrospective, going back through what he'd been certain about and checking it against what had turned out to be true. Marcus watched him for a moment. He had the sense of something moving toward resolution between them that didn't require a conversation to complete, the way some things resolved themselves by simply reaching their natural conclusion without needing to be spoken aloud. Then Cade turned and looked at him, held the look for 3 seconds. Then he reached behind the bar and got a second glass and poured something into it and set it on the edge of the bar within Marcus's reach and turned back to his own glass. Marcus looked at the glass. It was cola. Flat, from a liter bottle that had been open a while, in a glass that wasn't particularly clean. He got up and took it and sat back down and drank it. Nobody said anything. At 4 a.m, Reaper came and sat across from Marcus. The cigarette was gone. He had a mug of coffee now, and his jacket was off, and he looked, for the first time since Marcus had seen him, like a man who was tired in a way that was about more than one night. The kind of tired that was structural. The accumulated weight of a long time spent being the person a room organized itself around. The person who made the calls that couldn't be undone. The person who carried the results of those calls in the worn place around his eyes. He set the mug down and looked at Marcus. "Danny Reese is going to be okay," he said. "I heard Doc." "Terrell?" Reaper paused. He turned the mug. "That's going to be a longer conversation." Marcus nodded. He understood, in the general shape if not the specifics, what a longer conversation meant in this context. That Terrell had done something that could not be undone. That it had cost the people around him in ways that mattered, and that the path forward from that was not simple, and was not fast, and was not something anyone in this room was equipped to feel easy about yet. Understanding it didn't require being told. "What you said to me," Reaper said, "last night, about not lying." Marcus waited. "You don't do that for people you're using," Reaper said. "You don't hand someone a weapon against yourself." He turned the mug again. "You had no reason to tell me about the package, no reason I'd have connected it to you." "You would have," Marcus said. "Maybe." A pause. "But you didn't know that." Marcus thought about this. He thought about the moment he'd decided to say it. The specific internal movement, the sense of the sealed place cracking open again, the thing that had come up, and that he'd let come up because keeping it stored had seemed, in that moment, like a form of cowardice he wasn't prepared to perform. "I was tired," he said. It was the most accurate thing he could find. "I've been tired for a long time, of being careful, of making sure nobody could see anything they could use." He looked at the table. "I didn't want to do it in here." Reaper was quiet. "It's a bad habit," Marcus said, "trusting people." "Worst one there is," Reaper said. Then, after a moment, "Only one worth having." They sat with that for a while. The room was quiet around them. Ghosts breathing, the low creak of the building, the distant sound of the city that never fully went to sleep, the last of the night moving toward the earliest edges of something that wasn't quite morning yet, but was heading there. Reaper looked at Marcus directly. "You know what you are to me right now," he said. "No," Marcus said. "Honest, you're a 12-year-old kid who lives behind a condemned building and has been alone for 14 months, and has somehow kept himself breathing through that by being smarter and harder and more honest than most grown men I know." He said this flatly, without sentiment, the way he said things that were simply true. "That's what you are." Marcus held the words. "Let them be there." "And you're the reason my daughter is alive," Reaper said. "And you're the reason we found the hole in this crew before it cost us something we couldn't recover from." He paused. "That's also what you are." The lamp on the bar made its small, warm light. Outside, the first gray suggestion of the city reconsidering darkness appeared in the narrow window above the east wall. Not light yet, just the absence of the deepest dark. The preliminary negotiations between night and whatever came after. "You need somewhere to be," Reaper said. It wasn't a question. It was the same structure as the things he'd said the night before. The statement of a fact that he was allowing Marcus the opportunity to confirm or complicate. "Yeah," Marcus said. Reaper nodded. He turned the mug one more time and then pushed it aside and put his arms on the table and looked at Marcus with the full, direct gaze that had been looking at Marcus in pieces all night and was now looking at the whole thing. "I'm not going to make this into something it isn't," he said. "I'm not going to tell you this is going to be easy or that it's going to look like what you see in other places. It's not." He held Marcus's eyes. What it is a door and a bed and food and people who won't disappear on you. A pause. And work. Real work. Work that asks something of you. What kind of work? Marcus said. The kind that matters, Reaper said. You'll know it when it comes. Marcus looked at him. The scar, the worn eyes, the hands around the absent mug. The specific face of a man who had been through the specific things that produced that specific face, and who was sitting across a table at 4 in the morning offering a 12-year-old homeless boy a door and a bed and the word Lily as the code that meant safe. He thought about the alley. The 2 seconds between hearing the scream and moving toward it, the absence of deliberation, the way his body had done the math before his mind had the chance to overcomplicate it. He thought about his mother teaching him to make the good things last. He thought about 14 months of careful, cold, invisible survival, and the single moment when he'd stopped calculating and put himself between a scared 7-year-old and the thing that was frightening her. He thought about how that moment had led to this one. Okay, he said. Reaper looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once and picked up the mug and stood. There's food in the kitchen, he said. Bolt made something at some point. It'll be terrible. That's okay, Marcus said. Get some sleep after. He moved toward the window again, his default position, the city on the other side of the glass. Doc will check you again in the morning. Marcus got up. He moved toward the kitchen and then stopped. Reaper, he said. Reaper turned. Marcus looked at him. He had the thing he wanted to say somewhere in his chest, had it there since the alley, since the mug of coffee, since Lily had said he saved me over and over in the specific sincere repetition of someone who needed the adults around her to understand the full weight of what had happened. He had it there, and he needed one more second to find the form for it. I heard what Lily told you, he said. About scars, what you told her. Reaper was still. Scars just mean you survived something, Marcus said. He held it there between them. The plain fact of it. Both of them carrying their particular inventory of survival evidence. Reaper's visible, carved into the face, the hands, the specific architecture of a man who had been through things. Marcus's less visible, but no less real, the 14 months, the sealed places. The mother's face that he'd stopped letting himself look at, because looking at it cost too much. Reaper looked at him for a long moment. Yeah, he said quietly. That's right. Marcus went to the kitchen. The food Bolt had made was scrambled eggs and toast again. The same basic construction as the night before, with the same oversalting and the same slightly burnt toast. And Marcus ate it standing at the counter because there wasn't a chair at the right height. And it didn't matter. He ate all of it and drank the rest of the coffee from the pot that had been sitting so long it had condensed into something closer to tar, and it was the best coffee he'd ever had. He slept until noon. When he woke up, the building was a different room again. The third version of itself in 24 hours, the midday version, with the thin November light coming through the east windows and the smell of fresh coffee and someone frying something in the kitchen. The sounds of a place doing its ordinary things, voices in the main room, low and without urgency. The distant sound of a bike being worked on somewhere in the bay, a mechanical rhythm, patient and repetitive. He lay on the cot in the back room and looked at the ceiling for a moment and did his inventory. Ribs. Present, organized, manageable. Face, swollen on the right side, tight, the bruise fully established but no longer surprising. The rest of him, tired in the good way, the way that came from the body having been pushed to its limit and having come back from it. The specific tiredness that was the body's receipt for having survived. He got up and found his boots and his hoodie and came into the main room. Lily was there. She was sitting at the table with a glass of orange juice and a piece of paper in front of her. And she was drawing something with intense concentration, her tongue slightly between her teeth, her 2 braids redone neatly. Someone had fixed the braids, done them properly this time, and Marcus filed this detail without comment. She looked up when he came in. You slept a really long time, she said. Yeah, he said. Doc said that was okay. He said your body was catching up. She looked at him with the same serious, concentrated attention she'd been giving him since the alley. Does your face still hurt? A little. She nodded, processing this with the empirical solemnity of a 7-year-old. She looked at her drawing and then back at him. I drew you, she said. She turned the paper around. The drawing showed 2 stick figures in what Marcus understood to be an alley. There were gray walls indicated on either side and a dark sky above. One stick figure was larger and had what appeared to be a pink backpack, The other stick figure was smaller and was positioned in front of the first, arms slightly out, between the first figure and two other menacing stick figures on the left side of the drawing. The smaller stick figure had been given a specific detail that the other figures lacked, a small, careful circle in the center of its face that might have been meant as the split lip, or might have been something else. An identifier. A mark. Marcus looked at the drawing for a moment. "That's good," he said. "You can keep it," she said. He took the drawing and folded it carefully and put it in the front pocket of the hoodie, and Lily watched him do this with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose gift has been received correctly. Ghost came out of the kitchen with 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to Marcus without ceremony, and sat down at the table near Lily and looked at Marcus with the young, not quite finished face that had a slightly different quality than it had the night before, something a few degrees more settled, the way faces looked after they'd been through something and were finding the new position. "How you doing?" Ghost said. "Getting there," Marcus said. "Yeah." Ghost wrapped his hands around his mug. "Me too." They sat with that for a while, the 3 of them at the table. Ghost with his coffee and his healing ribs, Lily with her orange juice and her drawing materials, Marcus with the coffee and the folded drawing in his pocket, and the morning light coming in through the east windows at its flat November angle, gray and honest and sufficient. Bolt appeared in the kitchen doorway, looked at the table, appeared to find everything in order, and disappeared again. The sound of frying resumed. Doc came in around 1 and checked Marcus's ribs with the same professional brevity as before, and pronounced the situation unchanged, in a way that meant improving, and told Marcus to keep the tape on for 5 more days, and to come to him if the breathing changed. He asked if Marcus had eaten. Marcus said yes. Doc looked at him in the way that meant he was noting the improvement and not saying so, and moved on. Cade came in at 2. He came in from outside with cold on him, and he had a paper bag that he set on the bar without explanation, and he got coffee and stood at the bar and looked at the room the way he always looked at rooms, with the measuring attention, the assessment running. He looked at Marcus at the table. Then he came and sat down. Not across from Marcus, but at the adjacent angle, the same position Reaper had taken the first time, the not quite confrontational, not quite casual position. "I was wrong about you," he said. The words came out flat and direct and completely without preamble, the way Cade seemed to do most things. No runway, no warm-up, just the thing itself placed on the table. Marcus looked at him. "I knew it before Bolt came back with the package information," Cade said. "I knew it when you told Reaper about the package yourself. Nobody who was running a play does that." He turned his mug. "I kept going anyway. That's on me." "You had reasons," Marcus said. "I had history," Cade said. "That's different. My history is mine. It doesn't belong on you." He looked at Marcus directly. "So I'm telling you I was wrong." Marcus held the look. He thought about what Rook had said. Someone who had been inside had turned out to be outside, had cost them, and Cade had been close to what it had cost. He thought about the specific shape of that wound and how it would change the way a person looked at everything that came after, and how the changing wasn't weakness, it was survival. It was the same fundamental instinct that had kept Marcus himself alive for 14 months. "Okay," Marcus said. Cade nodded. He got up and went back to the bar, and the conversation was over, and that was also exactly right. No extension of it, no performance of resolution. Just the fact of it stated and received and incorporated. The afternoon moved forward with the unhurried quality of a place returning to its own rhythm after something that had disrupted it, the way water settled after you dropped something in it. Men came and went. The kitchen produced things at irregular intervals. Someone brought in a case of something from outside, and there was a brief logistical conversation about where it went. Priest sat at the far end of the bar and read something, an actual book, creased paperback, which Marcus found unexpectedly humanizing, and no one disturbed him. At 3, Reaper came in with 2 men Marcus didn't know, and they went directly to the back room, and the door closed. And what happened in there was whatever the next conversation in the long series of necessary conversations was. Terrell, probably, or the people above Dagger, or the structural questions about what had been exposed and what needed to be rebuilt. The machinery of the thing, the part that Marcus was not part of and didn't need to be. At 4:30, Reaper came out of the back room and came to the table where Marcus was sitting with Lily, who had upgraded from drawing to explaining the drawing to Marcus in extensive narrative detail. He sat down. Lily told him about the drawing without pausing, the way children continued explanations without adjusting for new arrivals. And Reaper listened with the specific attention he gave Lily. Complete, present, the carved face softened at the edges in ways that were invisible unless you'd been looking at it long enough to know what the default was. When Lily reached the end of the drawing's narrative, which involved, according to Lily, the smaller stick figure having decided before the alley that today was going to be a day when something important happened, which was not an element Marcus had supplied, but which Lily had apparently decided was true. She picked up her orange juice and drank from it with the satisfied finality of someone who has said what needed to be said. Reaper looked at Marcus. Danny Reese is going to stay here for a while, he said, until he's got his feet under him. Okay, Marcus said. Terrell? He paused. Terrell is going to have a long road. I know. The people above Dagger. Reaper set his hands flat on the table. That's a longer conversation than tonight, but it's being handled. He said this with the particular weight of someone who has made a commitment and understands the full cost of it. It's being handled. Marcus nodded. They sat for a moment in the table's quiet. Lily was drawing again, a new piece of paper, the orange juice mostly finished. Outside the windows, the November afternoon was doing its early descent toward dark, the light going orange and thin at the edges before the gray took over. I need to ask you something, Marcus said. Reaper looked at him. Last night, what you said. Marcus looked at the table. A door and a bed and food. People who won't disappear. He looked up. You meant that. I don't say things I don't mean, Reaper said. I know, He stopped. The sealed place again. The thing that kept needing to be opened and resisted being opened every time. I need to know it's not because of the alley. Not because I did something. Reaper looked at him for a long moment. The alley is why I know what you are, Reaper said. It's not why you can be here. He held Marcus's eyes. You can be here because you're a 12-year-old kid who needs somewhere to be and we have somewhere. He paused. Those are separate things. The first one showed me who you were. The second one is just what's true. Marcus held that. Let it sit in the sealed place without rushing it, without testing it for weaknesses the way he tested everything for weaknesses, without running the survival math. Just let it sit there. Okay, he said. Lily looked up from her drawing. She looked at her father and then at Marcus and then back at her drawing with the apparent satisfaction of someone observing a thing going the way she expected it to go. I told him you'd say that, she told her drawing. Nobody asked her what she meant by it. The meaning was clear enough. At 5:30 Bolt made dinner, actual dinner, something from a pot that involved more ingredients than the eggs, and had a smell that moved through the building and brought people in from other rooms, the way smells did when people were hungry and tired and had been through something and needed the specific comfort of a hot meal eaten in the company of other people. The table filled up, Rook, back from whatever the afternoon had required of him. Priest with his book closed and put away. Ghost with his carefully held ribs and his coffee. Kate at the end, not close but present. Doc with the efficiency of a man who had no patience for ceremonies but had patient tolerance for meals. Lily, between her father and Marcus. Bolt served everything from the pot with the graceless efficiency that was apparently his natural register for every domestic function, a large ladle, and a functional attitude about portions, and no one complained and no one talked much during the first round because the food was good and everyone was hungry, and that was sufficient. The second round was where the talking happened, low and without urgency. The specific conversation of people who have been through something together and are now on the other side of it and are taking stock. Not of the operational things, those conversations had different textures, sharper and more functional, but of the quieter inventory. Who was okay? What hurt? What the next few days looked like, in the broad strokes. Marcus ate and listened and said very little and felt the room around him. He felt the warmth of it. The specific dense warmth of a room where people had been gathered a long time. Smoke and food and the old wood that had absorbed decades of both. The low light over the table. The sounds of people eating and talking and being without performance, without theater, without the constant low-frequency fear that had been the background radiation of 14 months of living outside the protection of anything. He felt the weight of Lily's shoulder against his arm, where she'd leaned slightly in the way children lean toward things they'd decided were theirs. He felt the drawing in his pocket, folded small, the two stick figures in the alley with the small, careful circle on the face of the smaller one. He felt, very quietly, in the sealed place that had been cracking open in increments since the moment he'd heard a girl scream and move toward the sound. He felt something that had been gone for 14 months, returning in the way that things returned after long absence, slowly, tentatively, without announcement, arriving at the edges first before it committed to the center. Not happiness. Not yet. Something smaller and more durable than happiness. The sense that the next breath was not a problem to be solved. Reaper was at the window after dinner. The same position, the same city, beyond the glass, the same quiet. The snow had started somewhere in the last hour. The first real snow of the season, thin and tentative, drifting down through the orange streetlight in slow individual flakes that hadn't decided yet whether to commit to accumulating. Marcus came and stood near the window, not next to Reaper, with enough space that it wasn't an intrusion, wasn't asking for anything, just standing near the same view. The city was doing its night transformation again, lights coming on in windows, the distant sound of traffic becoming more specific in the cold, a bus going by on the street below, the warm yellow of its windows, the shapes of people inside who were going somewhere and would arrive. First snow, Marcus said. Yeah, Reaper said. They watched it for a moment, the flakes coming down past the streetlight, each one briefly illuminated and then gone. In this world, Reaper said, without preamble, the way he said things that he'd been thinking for a while and was now saying, family ain't blood. He looked at the city. It's who stands in front of the hit. Marcus looked at him. The scar, the worn eyes, the specific hands. The man who had crouched in an alley and asked, you stood in front of her and had heard the answer and had been changed by it the same way Marcus had been changed by being the one who gave it. He looked back at the window. At the snow coming down past the light, unhurried, each flake taking its time. Outside, somewhere in the city, a Harley started. One of the bikes out on a run, the deep percussion moving through the frozen streets. A sound Marcus had first heard as something foreign, and had heard enough times in the last 24 hours that it had started to sound like something else. Like the sound of the perimeter. Like the sound of something that moved through the dark and came back. He put his hand on his window frame. The glass was cold under his palm, and through it the city hummed and the snow fell, and the engines moved through the streets below like guardians doing what guardians did. Patient and constant and present, even in the dark, especially in the dark. For the first time in 14 months, Marcus Vale did not feel invisible. He felt found.